I think that was less than a minute, but anyway. She leaves me to find my way down the familiar hallway into the study. Mr. Loveday stands at his desk, his back towards me as he looks out into the night. I look around the room and grieve, as always, for the time when this was Stephen's domain, and I his willing, and sometimes not so willing, pupil, as he led me through my scholarship exam for grammar school, and later my confirmation. In those days I remember how the tidiness of his room always seemed to follow a cyclical pattern. It alternated between utter chaos and austere order, each manifestation reflecting Stephen's varying state of mind. Chaos meant lessons that receded in pursuit of a single point of shared interest, or were abandoned altogether as the digression was deemed to justify, or even demand, an evening walk. Order presented Stephen in a conscientious, even agitated frame of mind that resisted his every attempt at enthusiasm for the task before him, but guaranteed me, nevertheless, long hours of concentrated study. Under Mr. Loveday's residency, by contrast, the room has a heavy, settled air. Here is a room used to long-term occupation. The pictures on the walls hang easily, and even the books seem to stand on their shelves at well-accustomed ease. It is, in fact, a more comfortable room, but tonight I am far from at ease in it. So, Mr. Loveday speaks without turning around. His voice, low and ponderous, rolls around the room towards me. The prodigal returns. Uncertain whether or not an answer is expected, I hesitate a moment too long. The man turns his head, peering over his shoulder at me. Yes, Mr. Loveday. To what do I owe the honour of your presence tonight? While I never for one moment thought that the vicar would be pleased to see me, this interview promises to be harder even than I had imagined. I am home on leave, sir, a few days only, but I thought I could perhaps be of use. Well, isn't that a marvel? Mr. Loveday turns to face me at last. He is not tall enough to perch comfortably on his desk, so he contents himself with leaning against it, his chubby fingers stroking the polished wood behind him, as he looks me up and down. You see, I had thought that there was something amiss. You have been away for nearly 2 years without a break. I thought it was most unfair. You're only a volunteer, after all. He emphasises the word volunteer ever so slightly. In fact, I wrote to the War Office about it. Here his expression changes to one of even greater severity. Imagine my embarrassment when they wrote to tell me that you had been given your full amount of leave, but had refused to take it. My face is aflame. Whatever worldly justification I dreamt up in France will cut no ice here. I beg your pardon, Mr. Loveday, I murmur. It is for that reason I have called on you this evening. I know that I have been remiss. Remiss? Mr. Loveday's eyebrows rise a little higher. What you have been, Mr. Ellis, is maverick. So, I repeat my first question. Why are you here now? My mother is ill, I remind him, and I have not forgotten my duty to my parish, though I understand if it appears that way to you. My voice trails off helplessly. I am not convincing even myself. My reception here tonight is well deserved. Mr. Loveday moves around his desk and begins to leaf through some papers. Yes, I should say you do owe me something. He looks up at me steadily. This is a big parish, he says quietly. I was pleased to be offered it, pleased that I would have a curate under me, and a local man at that. Even better. I understood that there had been difficulties with the previous vicar. I open my mouth to protest at that, but think better of it. He is not wrong. What I did not expect, Mr. Loveday continues, was to find in my curate a man of such scant loyalty that he saw nothing amiss in accepting a war post the moment I was installed. I stayed on for 6 months, I insist, irritated in spite of myself. Yes, and you resented every moment of it. Mr. Loveday's smile is benign, but his eyes glitter. You are a mean-spirited creature, Mr. Ellis. You clawed your way out of this parish at the earliest opportunity, and I don't believe that you would have allowed anyone to get in your way. He has me there. I was desperate to get away from this place. Even after nearly 2 years in France, it is difficult to think of those last 6 months in Sussex. And up until this moment, the fact that I hung on as long as I did was a source of pride. However, Mr. Loveday is warming to his theme. Your selfishness is quite without parallel. I have no doubt that you have used your time in the army to create a quite different impression. But remember, Mr. Ellis, I know the truth. Even now you stand on your voluntary war service when you know full well that you are needed here. The fact that I haven't had you recalled is down to my predecessor. What? The reference to Stephen comes as a surprise. That's right. By a strange turn of events, my predecessor is now your successor, until such time as you see fit to return to us, of course. He raises his eyebrows. Mr. Forrester's stipulation, not mine. Yes, Mr. Ellis, he continues, evidently mistaking my look of bewilderment. Yet another colleague you have let down. I must say it is typical of Mr. Forrester's character that he blames himself for your behaviour, and typical of yours that you let him. That, I imagine, is the real reason you have chosen to stay away. Perhaps I should rejoice that your ability to feel shame might one day make you a better man. But I cannot do it, Mr. Ellis. I cannot do it. I feel sick. The thought of Stephen, held almost in veneration for his suffering, inspires in me only a familiar contempt for his silence. Yet once again it seems that I am in his debt. How does he manage it? His is a strange, charmed life. My hand wanders to my throat. Mr. Loveday stands and watches me impassively. There is no compassion in him. How could there be? I have kept my word to Forrester. It does not, however, mitigate my abandonment of my parish, not even in my own eyes. All my resentments at things past seem pointless, even ridiculous now that I am confronted with them, and I can hardly speak for shame. What can I do to make amends? I want no sermons from you, Mr. Ellis. No hero's return to the pulpit, if that is what you had in mind. Of course not, sir. The Church finds itself in a difficult position, Mr. Ellis, as I am sure you realise. Yes, sir. The national mission is our chance to show ourselves as the Christian conscience of the nation, to demonstrate to the people of this country that we are with them at this time of war. This is important, Mr. Ellis. I hoped to be able to rely on my curate, but where were you? In France, sir, with the men who are fighting the war. Oh, so you think this is funny, do you, Mr. Ellis? Can't resist a joke at my expense? No, sir. I regret my temper almost as soon as I've given in to it. I don't think this is funny at all. Do you know what I see when I look at you, Mr. Ellis? No, sir. A missed opportunity. That saddens me, Mr. Ellis, it really does. You did well in your studies, I understand. Your return to serve your deaconship here was irregular, but undoubtedly beneficial to the parish. And for a while after your ordination, this parish enjoyed the ministrations of 2 very able priests. My question, Mr. Ellis, is what happened? He fixes me with a look that feels at least as accusing as it is questioning. I really do want to explain as far as it is possible. Stephen— No, Mr. Ellis, he interrupts angrily, misinterpreting my intention. I don't want to know about Mr. Forrester. Let us leave that poor man alone, shall we? No, I want to know what happened to you. I give up. How can I explain myself without mentioning Stephen? I don't know, sir, I say at length. I couldn't stay. My reasons were personal, but I did not leave without permission, sir. You know that my application would not have been accepted without your agreement to release me. Correct. Loveday concedes the point grudgingly. But I did not expect you to disappear for 18 months with hardly a word. No, sir. I owe you an apology for that. It wasn't what I had intended. I stopped myself just in time. It was exactly what I had intended. I joined the army with no intention of ever returning to Sussex. Mr. Loveday catches my eye and nods. He knows what my intentions were. He looks at me and sighs. No, Mr. Ellis. When your leave is over, you may go back to the war and think about your service here. If you truly wish to contribute to the parish, you will write to us about your activities. I don't mean— he raises his voice above my attempted interruption— these bulletins you send in. They read like entries in an appointment diary. No, what I want, Mr. Ellis, is something I can print in the parish newsletter, something that will make my congregation proud of their curate. They are not proud of you now, Mr. Ellis. No, I say to the carpet. What was that, Mr. Ellis? The tone is arch, expectant. I force myself to meet his hard stare. No, sir, I don't suppose they are. Good. Well, I'm glad we've had this little talk. Mr. Loveday glances down at his desk. Good evening, Mr. Ellis. I am sure you can find your own way out. Dismissed. I stand on the street smoking once more, and wish that it were possible for me to simply dissolve into the darkness. But what other reception could I have expected? I would be flattering myself to say that Mr. Loveday's treatment of me was unfair. Too tired to think about it further, I drop my cigarette and turn back towards the inn. As I pass the church, the bell rings out, marking the half hour. 8:30. The candles are still lit within, a wartime extravagance that Mr. Loveday always insisted upon, to give hope in the darkness of war. The light glowing through the stained glass windows warms the street and brings me back to myself. Aware that at this time of night the church is likely to be empty, I cross the road and brace myself against the door, pushing my way into the silence beyond. At the threshold I stand still for a moment, absorbing the familiar scent of dusty air and incense, before stepping inside and letting the door close behind me, with a boom that resonates only as far as the neat rows of dog-eared hymn books at the back of the church. As the silence drifts back into place, there is an overwhelming feeling of absolute safety and peace that takes me by surprise. Moving up the aisle, my steel-capped boots ring out noisily on the flagged floor. I bow to the altar and lower myself into a front pew, newly comforted by the votive flame flickering in some unseen draught. Gold and silver gleam from the dark altar at which I was christened, confirmed, and ordained, and at which my parents were married. Outside in the churchyard, my older brother Jack is buried. I look up into the stillness arching above me. Ever since Jack died, my mother's only wish has been to join him. In an alcove behind the votive stands a statue of the Virgin Mary. She holds the Holy Child in her arms with an expression of such tenderness that I cannot bear to look at it for long. My eyes return to the altar and pray for forgiveness, for my selfishness, my thoughtlessness, and for my paralyzing self-pity. I am young, strong, and healthy, with an education and a vocation that was not my birthright, and even after nearly 2 years at war, I am alive. Yet for all that I am jealous of the brother I still miss. I am jealous of the dead. The door booms again, disturbing my thoughts. Someone has entered the church and now moves silently up the aisle. It is too dark to see his face before he reaches the altar, but the way he moves tells me that it is Stephen. It is 2 years since our last meeting, and to be honest, I never really expected to see him again. I have misjudged the man. Not only has he stayed in the village, he has returned to his ministry as a subordinate in the parish he once ran. I cannot help but admire him. Memories less admirable still linger, however, and I am relieved that he doesn't see me, sitting in silence as he steps lightly past me and bows to the altar. Crossing himself, he kneels solemnly, folding himself in prayer. In the silence of the church, I listen to the quiet murmur of Stephen's prayers. Stephen at prayer was always an inspiration to me. I longed to be able to lose myself in prayer as completely as he always could. He told me once that it was the best and purest part of his day, the only part of it that he didn't spend alone. It struck me at the time as a strange thing to say, as by then he had been married for some years. I wonder now whether something happened or started to happen while I was away in Chichester. It was possible to notice, even on brief visits, that those periods of silent communion had become shorter. By the time I was ordained, Stephen was unable to pray at all. Whatever else disturbed him, the loss of that one consolation brought him almost to tears. Tonight he seemed so calm and at peace with himself that I decide to wait and speak to him. I offer a prayer of gratitude for the sight of my friend so restored. Above our heads the wooden pulpit looms, silent and empty. Its dark form is almost sinister, reaching up into the darkness, but perhaps it is only the association of memory. As though it were yesterday, I see Stephen standing there in his vestments, the lectern before him, bearing his immaculately written sermon. He always wrote out a fair copy of his sermon before the service, never a single blemish on the page, though in all the years we worked together, never once did I see him look at it while he was speaking. For a moment I allow myself to listen to what he is telling us about God, our all-loving, benevolent Father. Then with a sinking feeling I hear again his smooth, educated voice start to falter, his usually imperturbable face suddenly contorted by an anguish that only he understands. Now, when I replay the scene in my head, it seems the easiest thing in the world to climb up into the pulpit after him, to take hold of his shaking shoulders and lead him away from public view. But I simply sat, frozen with embarrassment as he fought for mastery of himself, and did nothing for him. He won the battle on that occasion and finished the sermon, and indeed the rest of the service, with nothing more than an apology that his behaviour had suggested that anything was amiss. I don't think anyone ever gave him the credit he deserved for that display of humility and courage. How could we possibly have known then that it had been only a minor battle in a private war he had been fighting with himself for years? Yet we should have. I still wonder if his breakdown, by then only 3 months away, could have been averted if we had paid more attention then. At the altar Stephen continues to pray. From experience I know that he will be there some time. This is the part of the day he has set apart to talk to his God, and he will not be easily roused. Perhaps I should not disturb him after all. He is calm now. Taking him by surprise may only serve to upset him. With this resolution in place, I watch him for some moments more, then rise and slip steadily away. Thank you. Good night.